Where should I be looking?
Okay, good afternoon. Still good morning. Thanks for attending the Systems Thinking 101, Seeing and Being in Systems. It's a great number of people. We have 110 people attending today, and systems thinking is fascinating, and it's just really neat to have Derek here because he's so passionate about it. We have, as you can tell, or you will be able to tell, Derek and I are in the same room. We have taken COVID precautions. We're 6 feet apart, and we have 2 people doing video, and they're also apart. Thank you, James McKenzie and Kim MacArthur, for doing this, and Inderdeep for designing the poster. A little bit of house cleaning. We do a survey every time, and your surveys allow us to offer more webinars like these that you want to hear. And so the survey will come out 10 minutes prior to the end of the talk. Please fill it out. It helps us figure out what you like about it, what you don't like, and what you'd like to see in the future. And we really appreciate it. I really appreciate it because it's so helpful. I wanted to share that we're on the Lekwungen territories. And my last thing is Derek Maslenk. I really enjoy talking to him about systems thinking. He is deeply passionate about it and really educated on it. And so I'm happy to have him here and share his thoughts for an hour. And please take time, obviously, with the Slido to ask lots of questions. We're here to answer questions. Whatever we don't answer today, we'll answer in a blog, in the newsletter, in the next month. So I'm going to send it to Derek.
All right. Good morning. I just want to acknowledge that, as Ari mentioned, we're coming to you from, just trying to advance my slides here, from Lekwungen speaking people's territories, and just would encourage you to take an opportunity to identify where you're joining us from. It's important to acknowledge the traditional territories on whose privilege we have to work and play. So a bit of an agenda. Today we're going to go through basically a bit of an introduction into complexity science and systems, of course. We'll also want to introduce you to Indigenous ways of knowing, seeing, and being in systems. We're going to do a bit of an exercise called the iceberg, and then talk about how we shift or change systems. And then finally conclude with talking about being in systems. So I think increasingly we have an appreciation of how complex the world has become. There's more of us in it, and I think that our understanding is increasing, and our appreciation is growing for how everything is connected. I think in the pandemic, we've really come, this has really come to light, how interconnected and complex our world is. And so this, we talk about these things, particularly in government. We often, I don't know if you've heard this abbreviation, VUCA, that highlights sort of the nature of complex systems, that there's this increased volatility, uncertainty, complexity, of course, but also this ambiguous nature. There's also another abbreviation that's thrown around, TUNA, which highlights complex systems often behave in kind of a turbulent fashion. They're uncertain, often novel, exhibit novel behaviors, and again, can be highly ambiguous. So, understanding that as sort of a bit of a background to the value of systems thinking, what is a system precisely? So I encourage you to participate on Slido and provide us with a bit of an understanding of what constitutes a system. Element. Don't be shy.
In the actual box, sorry.
In the box, sorry.
Hmm?
It says enter a word over there.
Oh, it's in there. They're all coming up. We have 7 so far. Oh. I don't know how to change it. You want to show me, Kim?
Here we have a good example of complexity in systems at work. Understanding technology. Perfect.
Oh. All right, I'm going to read some of them off to you there.
Sure.
We have a set of processes,
Yep.
interconnected, connections, input, change, output, integrated components, and interconnected assembly, interacting parts, connectivity, framework, web of interrelationships. And thank you for everyone who's responding. We have 23 so
Perfect.
far. And let me see, I'll get you one more, relationships and
Perfect.
connectivity.
Excellent. Yeah, I think you've hit them all. So here's the official definition. We talk about a system is any group of interconnecting or interacting, interrelated, or interdependent parts that form a whole that has a function or purpose. And I think that's maybe the one part that was missing, is that they're doing something together. We understand them as a whole. So that's really important to understand when we're talking about being clear on what we're talking about. So other characteristics about systems is that systems have, as I mentioned, a purpose or a function. All parts must be present for the system to deliver its purpose or function. So these parts are working together, and their arrangement is important. It's absolutely crucial. If they're arranged in different ways, the system operates in a different way or might not actually operate at all. They maintain stability through feedback, and feedback is just another way of saying interrelationships. Frequently, they're unpredictable and counterintuitive, particularly when we talk about social systems or biological systems. They have emergent properties. So, seeing systems, thank you. I'm just learning this system myself. So seeing systems, understanding this is really valuable because we talk about how we understand and look at systems, and we can explain them to other people. And sometimes this, provides us with the kind of clarity. So what are some of the systems that you are familiar with? And I think we've already named a few of them as starters. So go to Slido and provide us with some systems that you're familiar with.
And you can see up there how many people have done it already.
Oh, okay. But we can't see the...
I can show it up. I just like keeping it hidden in the beginning.
Okay, gotcha. So this is a word cloud that we're...
Yeah, we'll turn
Okay.
to a word cloud shortly. Oh, this is great.
Yeah, so that no answer is a stupid one. This gives us a sense of systems, the way that you're perceiving systems and where you're coming from.
And I'll start reading out some while they're coming in now. A beehive.
Ah,
Figured you'd like that one to start with. I picked that on purpose. Social networks, human mind, celestial. I'm going to start putting them up so people can see them too. Food systems, ecosystem, forest, human body, car, windows, banking, arcs and orcs. I like that one. That's pretty funny. Eco, value, social, IT systems, countries, biosphere, crayon box. That's really neat. Organizations.
awesome. Yeah, great. A great range of examples there. I think you've named a number of them, some that are mechanical or kind of static, as well as others that are more complex and dynamic. So, ecosystem. I think, for those of us who have a background or live in this beautiful place, that's sort of the first thing that kind of pops to mind. We talk about food webs. This is an idea that was made really popular in the 70s and 80s. But ecosystems is the interrelationships of all these creatures that form something that's larger than themselves. Human networks is something that we understand as a system, and the connections and how those interactions, and in the time of this time of the pandemic, that appreciation and understanding and that interconnectability, and also what we can discern about that, become profoundly important. Somebody mentioned car. A car is a system, yes. And if you think about it, with the parts need to be put together in a certain way for the system to operate or to function properly, but also the interoperability between car systems, there can be problems. You just can't take one part from a different car, a different vehicle, and put it into another vehicle. This DeLorean, for example. Now, somebody mentioned a box of crayons. Now, that's an interesting one because there is a relationship between them, but I would posit that a pile of sand really isn't a system, because there isn't really any kind of relationship other than they're together. There isn't any kind of interaction. There's no kind of function or expression of them being together that's emerging as a property of that system. So I think that's really important to understand. So it's the way that those relationships come together. It's the value of those parts and what they bring that creates a larger thing. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. There was, I think, mention in there that sort of the biosphere, there's different scales of systems that were mentioned, I think, in your responses. So this understanding and appreciation that systems are nested, that we occur, I as a person, I'm in community, I've got a relationship, Ari's 6 feet away from me. We're in a room, there's 4 of us in the room, but we're part of this neighborhood, we're part of the city. So we can understand and appreciate the systems, particularly complex systems, are nested. They're comprised of multiple systems. And this idea of where we draw a boundary, and that's something that I don't think came out in sort of what makes up a system, is where we define where they stop and where they continue is really important. We do that in order to help ourselves understand what we're looking at, and so that we have a sort of a common viewpoint. And so somebody mentioned a brain as a system. It is, but it's also part of the body, right? So the context matters about how we consider the parts of the system or how we define it. So boundaries is something that human beings set to sort of explain what systems are. So this gets to that expression, can't see the forest for the trees, because often we're so focused on kind of an element or a smaller part of the system that we don't necessarily see the larger system. So this is why it's valuable to be very kind of concrete and to be able to explain things in a kind of a direct manner. So don't want to overwhelm people, because systems thinking and complexity science can sometimes feel like they are very complex. But systems thinking and complexity are something that actually human beings are kind of built for. This is something that we appreciate. And so in the words of Peter Senge, systems and complexity are just words to say something that people have understood as long as people have understood anything. We do not live alone. We have never lived alone. We live in a world of extraordinary interdependence. And this is something that we've appreciated throughout human history. And in fact, we don't have to go very far or in the past understand that this was the way that we saw the world very completely. And I think now more than ever, we have an opportunity to learn from our Indigenous brothers and sisters for this appreciation of a kind of a more holistic view of the world. So really want to identify this as kind of an important part. Often we think of systems thinking as being scientific and rational, but in fact it's very much indigenous. It's a holistic way of looking at the world. And in their words, here in North America, in Turtle Island, often the expression is used, all my relations. And all my of my relations indicates that kind of interconnectedness between the elements of the system, that we're all part of this larger whole. And that deep appreciation is a profound way of looking at the world, and it's a profound way of being in the world. So, in addition to kind of developing this appreciation of where we are and the world that we live in, and how things are connected in the relationships, the value of sort of a systems-based approach or a systems thinking way of seeing the world is that we can avoid past mistakes. Is that if we're looking at redoing or changing something, what systems teach us, or an appreciation of systems brings to us, is that if we do things the same way that we were doing them before, we're going to probably get the same kind of patterns and results. So we often go, in government, we like change initiatives, but we often are doing or repeating similar behaviors. And we're often surprised about, like, why are we getting the same results? And it's because that's the way systems work. So understanding kind of this, having this kind of this understanding really can put us in a better position to make change. And so if we're really interested in making fundamental change, we actually need to go deeper. We actually need to understand what the structural issues are, changing the nature of the relationship. So I really like this, this quote by Robert Pirsig from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, because it's exactly the kinds of challenges I think we're facing in government, we're facing in society. Are we prepared to actually change the foundations of the way that we're looking at things and the way that we're doing things? So systems thinking, an indigenous perspective, that's the opportunity to actually really see what's going on and appreciate what's going on. So that brings us to sort of the next point. We're going to do a bit of mapping through an exercise that I like. So it's called the iceberg. And so what do we know about icebergs? Ari?
They're cold.
They're cold? What else?
They're up north.
Ari's not working with me. What do we know? We look at, when we see an iceberg, maybe I'll set you up for success here.
Thank you.
When we see an iceberg, what do we know about when we see an iceberg?
We're not seeing everything.
Exactly. That, the rule of thumb, the heuristic is that 10% of the iceberg is what we see, 90% exists below the surface, right? And it's actually the 90%, particularly if we're in a large ship, that we should be concerned about. So the iceberg exercise really gets to this. So we often in the work that we do, the way that we approach problems is that we're often firefighting. We're often chasing symptoms. We see something occur, we want to attend to it immediately. And what the iceberg reminds us of is actually like what's going on below the surface. What are the fundamental solutions that may exist if we were to invest ourselves more, if we were to spend the time to understand what's really going on. So that's what the iceberg exercise is about. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to introduce you to the iceberg. So basically, the iceberg is kind of, it's divided into 4 levels. We've got the event, what's actual actually happened, the thing that we can agree that's happened. And then we ask the question, it's like, what's driving that event? What's the pattern or the trends that we've been noticing that have actually been resulting in this event? Can we connect this to anything deeper that's creating this? You might think about a wave as an event. Wave is part of a series of waves. The pattern of waves is like, can we see this event? Is it occurring over time in different ways? And then what's contributing to that pattern? So thinking of it back to the metaphor of the wave is, what is the structure of the shoreline? Is the shoreline actually creating these patterns? And you can see what's happening is you're starting to get to the root cause of what's going on. And if we go below structures, in this exercise is like, what are the mental models? What are the ways that we see the world, the kind of beliefs, the way that we organize ourselves around that are important to us, that are contributing to these structures, that are contributing to these patterns that are resulting in these events? And so what I'd like to do is just quickly walk through, we're going to try this using Slido, a walk through an example of an event that we're all struggling with right now that is really systemic, and I mentioned it before, COVID. So that's our event. Back in December, we had a case emerge, and it quickly spread, and in March, middle of March, basically here in British Columbia, we were shut down, right? So that's our event. So what were some of the patterns or trends that we might have noticed that it contributed to this event? I'll give you some time to think about that, and please contribute. So what are the things that you may have heard in the news? Some of this is think of it as retrospective. It actually helps us to actually have an appreciation after something has occurred, because then we can distill it. So we can make some sense of it. We call this retrospective coherence. So what are the sort of what's emerging from our understanding of this event? And we're in a much better place now than we were back even in March, right?
Yeah, a lot of knowledge from what's happened in the last 4 months.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're getting some response. I'll start reading a couple
Sure.
of them, but they're starting to come in nicely. Thank you. Globalization, traveling, testing unavailable, human movement, air circulation in indoors, hygiene practices, supply chains, lack of investment in U.S. education, global travel, international travel, denial, no social distancing.
So we've done something really interesting here. We've actually skipped the pattern. We've actually got to structural issues, which is great. So some of the patterns might is that we actually had indications there were previous pandemics, right? We had the flu, the Spanish flu. We had SARS. We had investments, places like the Center for Disease Control. There were people out there in the world that have been tracking these kinds of viruses for some time, and they knew, like if Dr. Bonnie Henry talks about, is that it's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. So they were tracking patterns, right? And those patterns we didn't necessarily pay attention to, but what's interesting in this conversation, we don't even have to go to the second question really, is that you immediately went to what was contributing to the pattern to these events. Is like, yes, we're more connected. We have a globalized world. There is a belief that, it's important to pay attention to these things, but we don't have the time to really invest in it, and we've dealt with them in the past, right? So what we would call these kinds of structural issues is like, how do we do this differently than what we're doing? How do we unconnect our world, or are we willing to make those kinds of investments that we need to make to actually avoid this issue? And if we go below that, if we go even deeper than that, it's like, what's driving those behaviors around, or those structural conditions? Is our globalized world is really important to us. Our economy, the way that it's structured, is something that we're heavily invested in it. And so to undermine that, there's actually fear. There is a belief that's important to keep this thing going, like this kind of like, if a loss of face. Like, what are the things that were going on that kind of normalize these behaviors that it was okay to ignore these approaches? To ignore experts like the Dr. Henrys that were saying, we actually need to pay attention to this. And most countries weren't paying attention. The ones that were paying attention, places like in Asia and China, and you look at those countries that have done well through the pandemic, is they were prepared because they were paying attention to these patterns. They started to change their structures and also their attitudes and beliefs. So mask wearing, checking people, a reduction in freedoms were something that they were willing to give up because they'd already had a past experience. So this is why I think the iceberg exercise is super valuable. It's a very, very effective way to get at what's driving these events, these fires that we continually might be facing. It's a really powerful way and a very easy way to engage people in, like, are we interested in going deeper and looking into what we're dealing with? And anybody can do this. There's lots of materials. We're going to provide, I think, some links. Generally, this is a very rapid way of dealing with, or to go through this exercise. It might be a world record. But normally, we would take about 90 minutes, hour and a half. That's an hour and a half, 2 hours to do this. And what you want to do is you actually want different perspectives in the room. And it's amazing, you basically are getting small groups to have discussions about this, to generate, working from an event, generating the patterns, talking about what the structures might be and what's supporting or driving those structures. And it's amazing the wisdom that emerges. And the more diverse your participants are, the clearer the picture you will get about what's actually happening. So this, and you're actually you're generating what ultimately is a sort of a simple system map, a kind of an expression of what people think is going on, and very, very valuable, and a really excellent way of actually engaging everybody in trying to address the problem or consider the problem that you're dealing with. Okay, moving on. So in some of the pre-readings or previewings, one of the previewings was how wolves change rivers. We're not going to take the opportunity to show the short video, but it's a remarkable example of how systems can change us, particularly when we try to change them. And we come at it from a place of, like, we know we've got the expertise to understand what's going to happen if we make these kinds of adjustments. So in Yellowstone Park, they reintroduced wolves after they had been extirpated for decades. They had been removed. And, I'll give away spoiler alert, is what they saw is not only was there a reduction in the ungulate or the deer and elk population, which had sort of exploded because they didn't have predators that were reducing their numbers. But what happened was, what they weren't anticipating what happened was the hydrology and the landscape actually changed as a result of the reduction in ungulates and the kind of changes that those resulted in. And so it had a profound, and all these experts were like totally surprised by what happened. So this is actually an emergent property from complex systems, is that they're not predictable. And that's actually one of the reasons why I'm so excited about and why I'm so passionate about this work, is because we undergo these kinds of change processes in organizations and often are surprised at what happens. And we shouldn't be. We should be anticipating surprises. So really encourage you to view that video if you haven't. And what it also talks about is this idea of how small changes can have transformative impacts. And a person who I really want to introduce you to that spoke a lot about this, unfortunately she's no longer with us, was Donella Meadows. And Donella Meadows was part of a group that really looked sort of at the forefront of systems thinking, a group out of MIT. And she was a profound educator as well, and farmer, actually. So she talks about, she sort of landed on this notion of change and leverage. And she was in a meeting and it sort of, crystallized in her mind, and she wrote down sort of these, identified very quickly these 12 points of leverage, where by actually focusing on them, you can have these profound changes within systems. So she talked about leverage and change as leverage points are places within a complex system where a small shift in one thing can produce big changes in everything. Leverage points are points of power. And leverage is something, it's quite mechanical. And at the time I think she was talking about this, her perspective was focused, I think their perspective was focused on, we can make these changes and they're kind of predictive. And the way I like to think about it now, and I think the way that the science is leading, is because there's these surprises, these unintended consequences. It's not a mechanical, it's not like you pull a lever and something predictable happens. It's kind of like acupuncture points. It's that there are places where you can, by actually having an intervention, that things change, but they aren't necessarily that predictive. So I like this idea of focusing, finding and focusing on these places or points of power where things can shift and where new possibilities can be emerged. So as I mentioned, and we're not going to go into this, I should also say that this is a very high-level view of systems thinking. And it's a bit of a teaser so that you come back for more. But Donella Meadows identified 12 places to intervene within a system, and and she organized them in their order of effectiveness. But as they become more effective, the degree to which you're able to utilize them or do them, they become more and more difficult to do. So it's easy, for example, to provide people with numbers about how they're affecting a system. An example of this would be providing, on our houses we have the electrical gauges. Is it the meter, the hydrometer? In Holland, in a community, they put them in the inside of the house, close to where people were congregated. And so that data, those numbers were very visible, and people could see their energy use as they were using the energy. And it changed the way that they were using energy. Those houses became much more efficient.
That's cool.
Right? So small change, profound effect, and fairly easy to do. But one of the larger changes that you can make is changing the paradigm of the system, the way that we view the world. We're undergoing one right now. And we've been forced into it with COVID. but we're struggling with it. Paradigm shifts are incredibly hard to accomplish, and systems resist them. And so that's the increase in difficulty. You can have this profound and massive change, but the degree to which you're able to achieve that is really, really difficult. These can be mapped to the iceberg as well. And so you can think about dealing with the event. It's something that we can do immediately, but it's not necessarily that effective. It's immediate. As you get down to sort of the structures and the mental models, places of higher leverage, they become increasingly hard to achieve. And as I mentioned, the higher the leverage point, the more the system resists you. And that's why societies rub out truly enlightened beings. And we see this in history. This is why, I work for a unit in government, the Innovation Hub, and we have an expression, change is hard. This is why change is hard, is because systems, and those of us within systems, we don't like to be uncomfortable. We don't like change, and we resist it because we found a place of equilibrium. And so systems resist change, and that's why it takes a profound effort or circumstances to change things. So moving on, another way that I mentioned system maps. So another thing that's useful is to actually be able to map out your system. And these can be incredibly complicated things. And the image that I'm sharing on the screen here is a view of Afghanistan, sort of during the height of the conflict, where they were mapping out the relationships that were involved in the conflict. Incredibly complex map, right? But extremely helpful to making, why are we making the choices we're making, and the ability to model different choices, different scenarios. And that's often how people get introduced to systems thinking, is through these very complex, kind of overwhelming maps that are very, very difficult to do. But another way, an easier way to come into that is through system archetypes. And so system archetypes are basically kind of expressions, systemic expressions that are repeatable, that we see time and time again. We talk about it as being, a visit to the system zoo. There's 7 or 8 system archetypes that we see repeated over and over again. And we can map those out, and when we see them, we can oh, that's what's going on. And we actually have ways that we can address it. We can be able to unpack them. So I really encourage you to look at the work of Peter Senge, Dr. Peter Senge, who, in the Fifth Discipline, his book, talks about these quite a bit. And by using system archetypes, we can learn how to structure the details into a coherent picture of the forces at play, but it also helps us to structure or to take appropriate responses. So coming to the close, I think. I'm looking at Ari, because Ari's been worried about me. So the world is a complex, again, going back to Donella Meadows, the world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system. We treat it as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. And our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch. So I think that's the challenge before us, is that we keep resisting this complexity. We keep resisting kind of the interconnectedness, taking more of a holistic approach. Dr. Russ Akoff used to say, we're so busy trying to fix the parts, and what we should be doing is only fixing those parts that are contributing to the fixing of the whole, a healthier whole. And what choices would we make then? But like I said before, is we're almost designed for this. This is who we are. In the words of Peter Senge, we're a loving systems intelligent species. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we fall in love once again with the world, with the interrelationships, with the interconnectedness, with how things work in a more holistic fashion. If we took that attitude, what could we accomplish? And I think I was reading something this morning that really brought a point to it. We know, looking at how systems break down, generally what systems, when they break down, is because they resist control. They resist domination. They resist these things that we inherently, almost intuitively understand as problematic. And yet we keep applying those kinds of processes to, particularly to living in human systems. And we need to question that. And I think some of the things that we're struggling with as a society, I know, Ari, you're going to be talking about it tomorrow with the talk on racism, but these are, the way that we're relating with each other in the world is inherently problematic right now. We need to make some adjustments. But we're equipped. We're actually equipped to do this if we choose to. So Donella Meadows, in her book, which I will hold up, Thinking in Systems, which is, and we'll provide a link to this resource as well. Really sort of an easy way, a brilliant introduction into systems thinking. In her last chapter, she talks about, after sort of like unpacking the complexity of systems and the opportunity, she sort of pulls back and says the same thing. We're kind of designed for this. And there's some things that we can actually do that are accessible. And so we've provided you with a list of 15 that she mentions, I think. And what we'd like you to do now is actually just take a moment to sort of identify a couple of those that you're interested in finding out more about. And what we'll do is we'll just do a quick poll to see which the top 3 are, and then I'll speak to them.
It's the living systems are one? Which one is that one?
Dancing with systems. Or I could just pick one.
Yeah.
I'll just pick a few.
One sec. We did find it.
You did? Okay. Sorry to being such a challenging.
Yeah, it wasn't in order. I'm so linear sometimes. Yeah, while people are writing in or clicking in, I like the acupuncture one. I've had acupuncture many times, and I'm always impressed where it's like, I've got my lower back to work on, and they do something in my foot.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Because they're treating you as a whole system, right? And there's an appreciation about making those choices and places, identifying those places, those meridians. That's going to have an impact. It's going to adjust things, right? They talk about adjusting and kind of thinking about the body as a whole and paying attention to elements that, often, in our medical system, we don't pay attention to. Increasingly, we are starting to, right? Understanding that, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. We've been very focused, we've been very good at pulling things apart and fixing things, It's helped us understand things, but what we've lost is a greater appreciation and understanding of the whole.
Yeah.
So, right? And it's challenging. It's challenging to find our way back. To me, this is like fundamentally what reconciliation is about. Reconciliation is about reconciling our view of the world and the way that we act in it. And we're profoundly lucky to actually have people that have survived kind of our rationalization of the world through colonialism and these constructs, which are very kind of like, we systematically try to remove kind of a holistic view of the world.
Yeah.
Right? So
we had lots of responses on that one. I'm going to
tell me which
this one. And as you can see, you like that.
I like that. I was wondering, I was watching that this morning. So And that actually just gets to, so the top one we have right now is pay attention to what is important, not what is quantifiable. And I think we've simplified that. It's not just what is quantifiable. Or that we have ways, we have a tendency to focus on what we can measure. And we have this, I think there's this saying that's, what you measure what matters, or what matters is what you measure. And we actually need to pay attention to some of these other things that we, the intuition, the things that aren't easily definable doesn't mean that they shouldn't be paid attention to. And what we've done is we've privileged the things that we found a way of quantifying them. But as we're understanding, as our appreciation for the world is growing, like quantum mechanics, for example, is our view of the world is not necessarily right. It's not what we thought it was going to be. So we should be paying attention to other pieces of information. Just because they're more qualitative doesn't mean that they don't matter.
Just go down a bit so you can see the rest.
So exposing your mental models to the light of day, I'm glad to see that. It's up there. So this idea is like we have a perception of the world, we have a viewpoint, and this gets back to my comments about the iceberg exercise, is actually having different views, like having a diversity of perspectives matters, because what you're doing is you're having people that have a different mental model, and the mental model is like how I view the world. Think of it that way. The lenses that you look through. We all have different perspectives of the way that we see things, and those perspectives matter. And privileging one over the other, while it might make things easier, it leads to groupthink. It leads to, basically, coming up with a solution that might not anticipate or work for everybody. So actually having different perspectives is useful, and it's difficult for us to achieve. And then listening to the wisdom of the system, glad that made that up there too, is that the wisdom actually is embedded within the system if we care to pay attention. And often we are trying to provide, we bring in outside experts, but if we just sat and actually considered what was going on, a lot of these things over time would reveal themselves. So this list of 15, we'll provide another link to this. It's in Danella's book, but it's available on the website. It's a profound way of actually looking at the world. A very useful kind of list to work through when you're working through problems and want to actually take a more systemic approach. And it's easy kind of there's a low threshold to cross and to understand them.
Yeah, and to that, Derek's going to do a follow-up blog. So in the survey, if there's something that you would want him to cover in the blog that was in this lecture, please share, and he will have all the information. It will be out in the next month.
And then as a closing quote, we'll give the last word to Danella. In the end, it seems that mastery has less to do with pushing leverage points than it does with strategically, profoundly, madly letting go. And so I think this is something that I struggle with, is how to let go in a way that allows you to accommodate the system and learn from it. And often this is like our past or preconceptions, the way things should work. But letting go and letting come is kind of the appropriate way to behave with complex systems.
Okay, I have some questions for you.
Okay.
How does the nudge theory work with systems theory, please?
Oh, that's a really good question. So with nudge, nudge is out of behavioral economics, and it gets to this idea that there are places that you can make encouragements. I think actually having a more systemic understanding of what's going on, or of the system that we're actually trying to change, puts you in a better place to actually make those choices about where you're going to make these encouragements. And so what I like about behavioral economics is that they're paying attention to things that aren't necessarily been paid attention. They're considering how human behavior is, like what matters to people. And they're making choices, and they're making these experiments to say, hey, if we do this, what happens? So they're probing, what we call as probing the system. So I think that there is an interconnectedness. I think the challenge is that any of these tools, we often like seize upon to fix everything, and they're not. They're not equipped to do that. And I think, you know, one of the other points that Donella makes in that list is be careful about, you know, be aware about how much you don't know. Our hubris, it gets us into trouble. And so this idea that we've built this tool, or we've come up with this kind of insight, and now we're going to apply it to everything, I think we've got to be careful of that.
Yeah, I agree. Curious about the difference between internal and external change drivers. Can systems be affected or changed from inside and outside?
Absolutely. I think we often look to outside conditions to change things. I think it's difficult. It can be difficult to appreciate, particularly if you're in a system that you think needs to change. I think the work that we're doing, you know, our unit's doing in government, it's hard. But yes, absolutely, there is actually a profound way that, you know, we talk about these within organizations as entrepreneurs, right? You know, we refer to them as change agents, innovation champions. And actually, we need to be, you know, we were having a conversation before this about paying attention to these outliers that are actually out exploring new territory. And I think the challenge within, you know, organizations like ours is actually would be investing in those individuals or teams that are exploring the edges, the boundaries of the system, and could lead to the next idea or the better ways of doing things.
Do you have any examples in the government?
Oh yeah, I've got, well, the person who set up the lab.
Peter
Watkins, right? You know, here's somebody who had an idea and had a notion that he pursued and persisted and carried this fire. I think any of the, you know, a lot of the people that you've got holding projects in the lab, what do you call them? You call them product owners?
Yeah.
Often these people are like, had this idea that they've been carrying for a while, right? And trying to find people that would join them in this and also challenge their ideas, right? And I actually think this is to me, this is kind of the emergent area of government systems, is how do we pay attention, like how do we keep the stability, like the things that we know how to do, while pursuing these outer edges or these change agents.
Yeah, I think it's key. I mean, like even this live stream, it's James McKenzie is behind the camera right now.
There you go.
He came to me and said, I would like to do it better. And so we tried it. And you need that to go forward.
Yeah. So paying attention is something that we need to do more of, I think, and it would be helpful.
Yeah, I agree. May you offer some sources for Indigenous wisdom as it relates with being in systems?
Yeah, so I shared, I think one of the previewings was a good friend of mine, somebody I consider a colleague, Mulaney Goodchild. She talked about climate change. I think there are a few. They're kind of hard to find. You know, if you spend, you know, for me, I've spent quite a bit of time in Indigenous communities and with elders, and those people, like, and we've got people like that within government that we can access and spend time with, that can provide that kind of appreciation and direct us, you know, kind of provide insights and sources of information that we can develop that kind of appreciation or understanding. So I'll see about providing something.
Yeah, maybe in the blog.
Yeah.
Okay. Quantum mechanics challenges systems thinking because systems work differently from how we think. Has anyone written about the quantum perspective on systems?
Probably.
Good answer, I guess.
And that's a good question. I mean, I think some of the challenges around systems thinking is it did come from a mechanical or mechanistic computational world. And even in Danella's chapter on, dancing with systems, she talked about how her view of systems changed in relationship to appreciation. I actually think biology or ecology has changed our way. We talk about complex adaptive systems as being profoundly different from these mechanical systems. We thought when this work began that we would figure out how to actually manipulate systems, and it would be predictable and controllable. That's what they were chasing. And quickly they realized is that wasn't possible.
Yeah.
Is that, complex adaptive systems behave, they have these emergent properties, they surprise us. But this is also kind of what makes them highly attractive. But it requires us to actually behave differently. So yes, there's a lot of discussion. I should say, I share a lot of stuff on Twitter, sort of pointing at things that are sort of crossing my field of view. And like this morning, I think I shared 3 things that really speak to this point. That's this kind of profound understanding of what it challenges us to do in the way that we work. So we can provide. We'll see about providing. So.
Okay, great. From Olga, what do you think about Jack Chapman's notion that any bureaucracy that is risk adverse, pro status quo, might hinder innovation in addressing systemic issues?
I would agree with that. That is risk averse?
Yeah.
What do I think about it? Yeah, I mean, I think it's understandable. In fact, systems, studying systems gives us some insights into this. Mm-hmm. Is that we are inclined to what we call an equilibrium environment. Mm-hmm. Systems want to be in a state of equilibrium, and they resist. There's a resistance to kind of a more turbulent state. Doesn't mean that they don't go there, but it's understandable. And I think we actually have to develop our empathy around that. Mm-hmm. And also help people, because some people are actually wired to be in more of a turbulent, change-related environment than others. Others like, no, I'm comfortable doing what I'm doing. This is what I need, and we actually need to consider both.
Both are fantastic.
Yeah, and they have their roles. If we were constantly chasing things, and in a state of flux, we wouldn't necessarily be that effective, right? So. I think there's a balance to be struck there. So I think in a bureaucracy, there's things that we actually have to hold in place. There's things that we can maintain, that we're looked to providing, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be investing in some of these emergent areas. And we're seeing the kinds of things that we're struggling with: climate change, homelessness, pandemic,
fires.
Right? Fires, yes. Right. So it's a both and. Kind of approach. I don't think it's completely, I guess I'm pulling back a little bit, is that we should be investing, but we shouldn't put all our eggs in, chasing after the status quo, as we like to say at the hub. Great.
It's 12 o'clock, and we've answered all the questions with the likes. Thank you for participating. There was lots of great interaction throughout. Thank you a lot for doing this, Derek. It's always a pleasure to work with you. Please fill out the survey, and there'll be another talk tomorrow on Face-to-Face with Racism. A lot of people are attending. I think it's at 400 already. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
And see you tomorrow.
Okay.